3 weeks ago, I watched my 17-year-old daughter Chloe collapse to her knees in my sister's living room, holding pieces of midnight blue silk that had once been her dream prom dress. The dress we'd saved for 6 months to buy. The dress that had made her eyes light up like stars when she first tried it on at Enchanted Evenings boutique. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My sister Victoria stood there with scissors still in her hand, smiling like she'd just watered her garden instead of destroying my child's heart. When I demanded an explanation, she shrugged and said Chloe was being dramatic over some fabric. But this morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with notifications. Apparently, my mother, Federal Judge Margaret Hartwell, had just issued an arrest warrant on live television during a court proceeding, and my sister's name was on it. The air conditioning hummed softly in Victoria's pristine living room, the kind of space that belonged in a home decorating magazine, rather than a place where children actually lived. Everything was cream and gold, from the designer throw pillows arranged with mathematical precision to the coffee table that had never seen an actual coffee ring. My daughter Chloe sat cross-legged on the marble floor next to my niece Brianna, both girls surrounded by craft supplies and fabric samples as they worked on some last-minute prom preparations. I'd driven Chloe over to Victoria's house that Tuesday afternoon because Brianna had volunteered to help with alterations. My sister had made a big show of offering, claiming that her daughter was practically a seamstress after taking 1 semester of fashion design at Millbrook Prep. Victoria always found ways to insert herself into moments that mattered, especially when they involved Chloe. She had this pattern of swooping in with grand gestures right before important events, as if she wanted to be remembered as the aunt who saved the day. The dress hung on a portable garment rack that Victoria had dramatically wheeled out from her walk-in closet, claiming it was professional-grade equipment left over from her brief stint as a personal stylist. The midnight blue silk caught the afternoon light streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows, and even I had to admit it looked magical hanging there. Chloe had fallen in love with it the moment she saw it at Enchanted Evenings, running her fingers along the delicate beadwork that cascaded down from the bodice like captured starlight. That dress represented months of careful budgeting. After my divorce from Chloe's father 2 years earlier, money had become something I calculated down to the dollar. I'd started bringing lunch to work instead of buying it, switched to generic groceries, and even picked up weekend shifts at the local coffee shop just to make sure Chloe could have the prom experience she deserved. When she'd found that dress marked down from $800 to $400, I'd still had to put it on a payment plan. 3 months of $100 installments, but the joy on her face when we finally brought it home made every sacrifice worth it. Victoria knew all this, of course. She'd made pointed comments during family dinners about how I was probably overspending on something Chloe would wear once, how practical people bought dresses from department stores, how she'd gotten Brianna's gown for half the price by shopping smart. But then she'd pivot and offer to help with accessories or makeup, playing the supportive aunt role with just enough enthusiasm to make it seem genuine. I should have recognized the signs. Victoria had always been competitive about everything, but it had gotten worse since her divorce settlement had left her with the house, the cars, and enough alimony to maintain her lifestyle without actually working. She filled her days with volunteer committees and social media posts about her perfectly curated life. But there was an emptiness underneath all the performance that made her sharp around the edges. The rivalry between our daughters had been simmering for months. Brianna was beautiful and popular, the kind of girl who seemed to glide through high school without effort. She'd been crowned homecoming queen, held leadership positions in 3 clubs, and had already received early admission to Northwestern. Chloe, on the other hand, was quieter, more thoughtful. She painted watercolors in her spare time, wrote poetry that made me cry when she shared it, and had a small but devoted group of friends who appreciated her gentle sense of humor. Different girls, different strengths, but Victoria seemed to view every one of Chloe's achievements as somehow diminishing Brianna's shine. The tension had escalated when Chloe was elected as junior class representative to the prom planning committee. It wasn't a huge honor, but Chloe had been thrilled to help choose the theme and decorations. Brianna had wanted the position too, expecting it to be handed to her like most things were, and Victoria had spent weeks making subtle digs about popularity contests and how some people peaked in high school while others built lasting success. I was in Victoria's kitchen that afternoon, helping myself to a glass of water from her ridiculously expensive filtration system, when I heard Chloe gasp from the living room. Not a happy gasp, but the kind of sound that comes from somewhere deep in your chest when something precious gets broken. I set down the glass and walked quickly toward the sound, my maternal instincts already on high alert. What I found still plays in my mind like a slow-motion movie scene. Chloe was on her knees, holding pieces of midnight blue fabric in her trembling hands. The dress that had hung so beautifully just minutes before was now in sections, cut with surgical precision along the seams. The beadwork that had taken craftspeople hours to apply was scattered across Victoria's spotless floor like broken dreams. Victoria stood near the garment rack, holding a pair of fabric scissors that I recognized from her craft room. Her expression was calm, almost serene, like someone who'd just finished a satisfying task. Brianna sat frozen on the couch, her mouth open in shock, clearly as surprised as the rest of us by what had just happened. The silence stretched between us like a held breath. Chloe looked up at me with tears already streaming down her face, and I saw something break in her eyes that went deeper than disappointment. This wasn't just about a dress anymore. This was about trust, about family, about the cruelty that people could inflict on those who loved them most. I found my voice first, though it came out quieter than I intended. "Victoria, what did you do?" She set the scissors down on her coffee table with deliberate care, then smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her designer blouse. "Oh, that old thing. I was just helping Chloe understand that sometimes we need to be more realistic about our expectations." The casualness of her tone made my stomach turn. This wasn't an accident or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated cruelty, delivered with the same tone she might use to comment on the weather. Chloe's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "But it was my prom dress. It was perfect." Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive. "Honey, it was just fabric. Very expensive fabric that your mother probably couldn't afford in the first place. Now maybe you can find something more appropriate for your budget." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just the attack on our finances, but the complete lack of empathy for a teenage girl whose dreams had just been literally cut to pieces. I looked at my sister, this woman I'd grown up with, shared secrets with, defended against playground bullies and teenage heartbreaks, and I didn't recognize her at all. Brianna finally found her voice, speaking in a tone I'd never heard from her before. "Mom, that was really mean. Chloe didn't do anything wrong." Victoria's facade cracked just slightly, a flash of irritation crossing her perfect features. "Sometimes people need to learn that the world doesn't revolve around them, Brianna." Chloe was getting a little too comfortable being the center of attention. I knelt down next to my daughter, gathering the pieces of her dress and trying to assess if there was any way to salvage it. The cuts were clean and deliberate, placed precisely where they would do the most damage. This wasn't vandalism born of sudden rage. This was premeditated destruction designed to cause maximum pain while leaving just enough plausible deniability. Chloe leaned against me, her whole body shaking with the kind of sobs that come from betrayal rather than simple sadness. I wrapped my arms around her and felt something shift inside me, a protective fury that was different from anger. This was deeper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous than rage. I stood up slowly, still holding the ruined dress, and looked directly at Victoria. "We're leaving. And we won't be coming back." She rolled her eyes like I was being overdramatic. "Oh, Diana, don't be so sensitive. It's just a dress. Chloe can find another one at Target or something." That's when I understood that this wasn't really about Chloe or the dress or even our daughter's rivalry. This was about power, about Victoria's need to remind me that she could take away anything that mattered to us, anytime she wanted. She'd been building to this moment for months, maybe years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to show us exactly where we stood in her world. I helped Chloe to her feet and guided her toward the door, not trusting myself to say anything else. As we reached the threshold, Victoria called out with false sweetness, "Give my love to Mom when you see her next. I'm sure she'll understand that some lessons need to be taught the hard way." The mention of our mother sent a chill down my spine. Victoria had always been Judge Margaret Hartwell's favorite, the daughter who'd married well and maintained the family's social standing. But she'd also been the one who tested boundaries, who pushed to see how much she could get away with before facing consequences. We drove home in silence, Chloe clutching the pieces of her dress like she couldn't quite accept they were really destroyed. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, watching her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and a kind of resigned sadness that no 17-year-old should have to feel. When we reached our small apartment on Pine Street, Chloe went straight to her room and closed the door. I sat at our kitchen table, staring at my phone and trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to call Victoria and demand she replace the dress immediately. Part of me wanted to call my mother and report what had happened, though I knew from experience that family loyalty often trumped justice in Judge Hartwell's world.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Instead, I found myself Googling prom dress shops that might have something in Chloe's size with less than 2 weeks' notice. The prices made my chest tight. $400 had been a stretch, but now I was looking at rush orders and limited selections that would cost twice as much. That's when I noticed the timestamp on the photos I'd taken of the dress destruction. In my shock, I'd instinctively documented the scene with my phone, capturing Victoria with the scissors, the cut fabric, Chloe's devastated face. I hadn't planned it, but some part of my brain had understood that this moment needed to be preserved. I scrolled through the images, and something clicked into place. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was destruction of property, deliberate and malicious. Victoria had committed a crime, and I had evidence. The realization didn't make me feel better, exactly, but it gave me something I hadn't had since walking into that living room. It gave me options. Later that evening, after Chloe had cried herself to sleep, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and really looked at those photos. Victoria's face in the first image was unmistakable, calm satisfaction, like she'd just completed a project she'd been planning for weeks. The precision of the cuts became more obvious in the close-up shots. The scattered beads told their own story of careful, methodical destruction. I thought about all the times Victoria had undermined me, with subtle comments and passive-aggressive gestures. How she'd questioned my parenting choices at family gatherings, suggested that maybe Chloe would be better off living with her father, implied that my modest lifestyle was somehow a moral failing rather than a practical reality. This was different, though. This crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed with apologies or explanations. She'd looked my daughter in the eye and destroyed something precious to her, not in a moment of anger, but as a calculated demonstration of power. I picked up my phone and scrolled to my mother's contact information. Judge Margaret Hartwell was many things: fierce, uncompromising, occasionally terrifying. But she'd raised us with a clear understanding of right and wrong. She might play favorites, but she'd never tolerated cruelty for its own sake. My finger hovered over the call button for a long time before I finally set the phone aside. This decision needed to come from a clearer place than late-night anger and protective fury. But as I finally headed to bed, I could feel something hardening inside me, a resolve that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. Victoria thought she'd taught us a lesson about our place in the family hierarchy, but she'd actually taught me something much more valuable. She'd shown me exactly who she really was, and she'd given me the evidence to prove it. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities. Tonight, I just held space for my daughter's broken heart and let myself feel the full weight of what had been done to us. But underneath the sadness, something else was growing. Something that felt like justice, waiting to be born. The morning after brought no relief, only the harsh reality of fluorescent lights in the dress shop and Mrs. Elena Costas shaking her head with genuine sympathy. I'd called Enchanted Evenings as soon as they opened, explaining the situation in carefully measured words that didn't quite capture the deliberate cruelty behind the destruction. Mrs. Costas, a woman in her 60s who'd been helping girls find perfect dresses for over 30 years, listened with the patience of someone who'd heard every prom emergency imaginable. "I wish I could help you, Diana," she said, her accent carrying traces of her Greek heritage. "But that particular dress, it was the last one in that size and color. The designer discontinued that line 6 months ago." She gestured toward the wall where similar styles hung, all beautiful but none quite the same. "I have some lovely alternatives, but with prom being next weekend, the selection is limited." Chloe stood beside me, her face carefully blank in the way teenagers perfect when they're trying not to fall apart in public. She'd insisted on coming along, claiming she was fine, but I could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she touched the remaining dresses. None of them sparked the same light in her eyes that the midnight blue silk had ignited. Mrs. Costas pulled a few options that might work with overnight alterations, each carrying price tags that made my stomach clench. Rush jobs cost extra, weekend work cost more, and even the least expensive option would drain what little remained in my emergency fund. I watched Chloe trying on a burgundy gown that was pretty enough but completely wrong for her coloring, and I felt that familiar mother's guilt that comes when you can't give your child everything they deserve. "What about this one?" Chloe asked, stepping out of the dressing room in a silver dress that washed out her complexion and hung awkwardly in all the wrong places. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's nice, right? And it's only $300 on sale." I wanted to cry looking at her, this beautiful girl trying so hard to pretend that settling for less was perfectly fine. The silver dress might have been acceptable for someone else, but it turned my vibrant daughter into a shadow of herself. Still, she was willing to take it because she knew our financial situation better than most teenagers should. That's when Mrs. Costas surprised us both. She disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a garment bag with careful reverence. "I wasn't going to mention this because it's not technically for sale," she said, unzipping the bag slowly. "But sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need." Inside was a dress that took my breath away. Deep emerald green silk that seemed to capture light and hold it, with delicate silver embroidery that flowed like water across the bodice. It was elegant without being flashy, sophisticated, but still young enough for prom. When Mrs. Costas held it up against Chloe, the transformation was immediate. The color brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes and made her skin glow like she was lit from within. "It's a sample from next year's collection," Mrs. Costas explained, watching Chloe's face with satisfaction. "The designer sent it for me to display, but honestly, it's been hanging in my office for months. I've been waiting for the right girl to come along, someone who would do justice to the craftsmanship." Chloe ran her fingers along the embroidery with reverent care. "It's incredible, but we can't afford a sample from next year's collection. It must cost a fortune." Mrs. Costas smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she'd already made up her mind about something. "For you, my dear, it's the same price as your original dress. $400, alterations included. Consider it my contribution to making sure this story ends better than it started." The kindness of strangers has a way of hitting you when you're already emotionally raw. Standing in that boutique, watching my daughter's face transform from resignation to wonder, I felt tears threatening for the first time since the incident at Victoria's house. This woman barely knew us, but she'd recognized something worthy of rescue in our situation. We arranged for the final fitting that Thursday, giving Mrs. Costas just enough time to make the necessary adjustments. As we prepared to leave, she handed me a business card for a photographer who specialized in prom portraits. "Tell David the first sent you," she said with a wink. "He owes me a favor, and I think Chloe deserves to have this dress documented properly." The drive home felt different than our previous trip from a dress shop. Chloe chattered about accessories and how the green would look with the silver shoes we'd already bought, her natural enthusiasm slowly returning like a flower turning toward sunlight. For the first time since Tuesday afternoon, I allowed myself to hope that maybe we could salvage this experience after all. That hope lasted exactly until we reached our apartment and found Victoria's car parked in our driveway. She was leaning against her pristine white BMW, checking her phone with the casual air of someone who owned the world and everyone in it. When she saw us approaching, she looked up with a smile that might have seemed friendly to anyone who didn't know her well. But I could read the calculation behind her perfectly applied makeup, the way she positioned herself to suggest casual concern while actually blocking our path to the front door. "Diana, sweetie, I've been waiting for you," she called out, as if ambushing us at our own home was perfectly normal behavior. I felt terrible about yesterday's little misunderstanding, and I wanted to make things right. Chloe stepped slightly behind me, a protective instinct I recognized from her childhood when playground bullies would corner her after school. The fact that she felt the need to seek shelter from her own aunt told me everything I needed to know about how the dress incident had affected her sense of safety within our family. Victoria opened her car door and retrieved a large shopping bag with designer logos splashed across its surface. "I picked up a few options for Chloe's prom," she announced, holding the bag like a peace offering. "Nothing too expensive, but I thought we could find something that works within your budget constraints." The phrase budget constraints was delivered with the particular tone Victoria reserved for discussing other people's financial limitations. She'd perfected this balance of sympathy and superiority that allowed her to appear generous, while actually highlighting exactly how much better her situation was than yours. I didn't move to accept the bag. "We've already found a dress, Victoria, but thank you for the thought." Her smile flickered just slightly, a micro-expression that revealed her surprise at being turned down. Victoria was accustomed to grand gestures being received with gratitude, especially when they came after she'd created the problem in the first place. The pattern was familiar from our childhood. Victoria would break something, then swoop in with a replacement that was never quite as good as what she'd destroyed, expecting praise for her generosity rather than accountability for her actions. "Oh, but I insist," she said, stepping closer with the bag extended. "After all, family takes care of family, and I'd hate for Chloe to miss out on her special night because of a silly accident." There it was, the reframing that I'd been expecting. Yesterday's deliberate destruction had now become a, quote, silly accident in Victoria's revised version of events. She was testing to see if we'd accept this new narrative, if we'd participate in the collective amnesia that often followed her worst behaviors. Chloe found her voice before I could respond. "It wasn't an accident, Aunt Victoria. You cut up my dress on purpose because you were mad about something." The directness of a teenager's honesty cut through Victoria's carefully constructed denial like a knife through silk. She blinked several times, clearly not expecting to be challenged by someone she considered beneath her notice most of the time. "Chloe, sweetheart, you're being dramatic," Victoria replied, her tone sharpening despite her attempt to maintain the loving aunt facade. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about what's best for everyone involved. That dress was really too mature for someone your age anyway." I felt something snap inside me, a tension wire that had been stretched too tight for too long. "Victoria, you need to leave. Now." She straightened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the entitled anger that lived underneath her polished exterior. "I'm trying to help you, Diana. The least you could do is show some appreciation instead of making this harder than it needs to be." "Help?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "You destroyed my daughter's prom dress with scissors, made her cry, and now you want credit for offering replacements? That's not help, Victoria. That's manipulation." Her mask slipped completely then, revealing the cold calculation that had always been there. "You know what your problem is, Diana? You've never understood that actions have consequences. Maybe if you'd taught Chloe some humility instead of letting her think she deserves everything handed to her, we wouldn't be in this situation." The blame shifting was so audacious it took my breath away. According to Victoria's logic, a 17-year-old girl deserved to have her property destroyed because she lacked sufficient humility. The circular reasoning was designed to make me question my own perception of events, to wonder if maybe I was being unreasonable in my anger. But this time, I didn't take the bait. "Get off my property, Victoria." And don't come back unless you're prepared to pay for the dress you destroyed, and apologize to my daughter for what you did." She laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Pay for it? Diana, that dress cost more than you make in a week. Maybe this is exactly the reality check you both needed." I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, not to take a picture, but to let her see that I was prepared to document this conversation the same way I documented yesterday's destruction. The sight of the phone seemed to remind her that she wasn't operating in complete privacy, that her words and actions might have consequences beyond this moment. Victoria's expression shifted back to false sweetness, but there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Fine. I can see you're not in a place to accept help right now. But Diana, you might want to think carefully about how you handle family relationships. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria was connected to everyone who mattered in our family's social circle. She had influence with our mother, relationships with extended family, and the kind of social capital that could make life complicated for someone who opposed her. After she drove away, Chloe and I sat on our front steps for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. The shopping bag Victoria had tried to leave behind lay abandoned on the driveway, its designer logos suddenly looking more like warning labels than status symbols. "Mom," Chloe said quietly, "are we going to be okay?" It was such a loaded question from a teenager who shouldn't have to worry about adult family politics affecting her daily life. I wanted to reassure her that everything would work out fine, that Victoria's threats were empty bluster, that family members don't really destroy each other over prom dresses and wounded pride. Instead, I told her the truth. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but whatever happens, we'll face it together." That evening, I called my best friend Natalie Rodriguez, a woman I'd known since college who had the rare gift of seeing situations clearly without getting caught up in family loyalty or social expectations. Natalie worked as a paralegal for a downtown law firm, and she had a practical understanding of how conflicts could escalate from personal drama into legal territory. I told her everything, from the dress destruction to Victoria's visit that afternoon, and I could hear her taking notes on the other end of the phone. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Diana, you know I love you, but I need to ask this directly. Are you absolutely certain that Victoria cut up the dress intentionally? Because what you're describing isn't just mean behavior. It's destruction of property, and depending on the value involved, it could be a felony." The question forced me to examine my certainty about Victoria's motivations. Could there have been some other explanation for what I'd witnessed? Some scenario where the dress got destroyed accidentally, while Victoria was innocently trying to help with alterations? But as I thought through the evidence, the deliberate nature of the destruction became even clearer. The precision of the cuts, Victoria's calm demeanor afterward, her immediate pivot to blaming Chloe for being dramatic, rather than expressing shock or remorse about an accident. Even her comment about teaching lessons suggested premeditation rather than impulse. "I'm certain, Natalie, this wasn't an accident or a moment of poor judgment. It was calculated cruelty designed to hurt my daughter and demonstrate Victoria's power over us." Another pause, then Natalie's voice became more serious. "Okay. Then you need to document everything. Write down exactly what happened, when it happened, who was present. Save those photos you took. Keep records of any financial impact, like having to buy a replacement dress or missing work to deal with this situation. You think I should report this to the police? I think you should be prepared for the possibility that this won't stay contained within the family," Natalie said carefully. Victoria sounds like someone who escalates rather than backing down when challenged. If she decides to make your life difficult through other means, you'll want evidence that establishes a pattern of harassment. The conversation left me feeling both validated and unsettled. It was reassuring to have someone outside the family confirm that Victoria's behavior was unacceptable. But it was also terrifying to consider how far this conflict might extend beyond a destroyed dress and hurt feelings. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything I could remember about the past few months of interactions with Victoria. The subtle digs about my parenting, the comments about Chloe's achievements, the way she'd positioned herself as the generous aunt while actually undermining my relationship with my daughter. What emerged was a pattern I hadn't fully recognized while living through it. Victoria had been systematically chipping away at Chloe's confidence and my authority as a parent, setting the stage for the dramatic demonstration of power that culminated in the dress destruction. The next morning brought unexpected validation for my concerns. Chloe came downstairs for breakfast with her phone in her hand and a confused expression on her face. "Mom, did you know that Aunt Victoria posted about the prom dress thing on her Instagram?" My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "What did she say?" Chloe turned her phone toward me, showing a carefully crafted post that made my stomach turn. Victoria had posted a photo of herself holding the shopping bag she'd tried to give us, with a caption that painted her as the long-suffering aunt trying to help an ungrateful family member. "Sometimes we have to love our family through their difficult phases," the post read. "When pride gets in the way of accepting help, all we can do is keep offering grace and hope they find their way to gratitude. Some lessons are harder to learn than others, but family is worth the effort." The comments underneath were a mixture of supportive responses from Victoria's social circle and confused questions from people who didn't understand the context. But the overall narrative was clear. Victoria was positioning herself as the victim of our unreasonable behavior, building a social media case for her version of events before we'd even decided how to respond. I screenshot the post immediately, adding it to my growing collection of evidence. Victoria's need to control the narrative had just provided me with documentation of her manipulative tactics, preserved in her own words for anyone who might question what kind of person deliberately destroys a teenager's prom dress. The game had changed. This was no longer a private family conflict that could be resolved through direct communication or maternal intervention. Victoria had made it public, which meant she was prepared to wage this battle on multiple fronts simultaneously. As I looked at my daughter's confused face, I realized that protecting her was going to require more than just finding a replacement dress and moving forward. It was going to require taking a stand against someone who had decided we were acceptable casualties in her ongoing campaign to be the center of attention. The emerald dress hanging in Chloe's closet was beautiful, and Mrs. Costas's kindness had saved our prom experience. But the real battle was just beginning, and I was no longer sure that family loyalty was worth the cost of teaching my daughter to accept cruelty as the price of belonging. The revelation came on Thursday morning, through a phone call I never expected to receive. Zoe Patterson, Chloe's best friend and someone I'd known since the girls were in elementary school, called me while I was getting ready for work. Her voice carried the particular urgency that only teenage girls can achieve when they've discovered something that changes everything. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to tell you something about what happened with Chloe's dress," Zoe said without preamble. "But you have to promise not to tell anyone where you heard this, because I could get in serious trouble." I sat down on my bed, still holding my work blazer. "Zoe, what's going on?" There was a pause, then the sound of a door closing. "I was at Brianna's house last weekend, helping her with her calc homework. We were in her room, and she got a phone call from her mom. I wasn't really paying attention at first, but then I heard Mrs. Barnes say something about teaching people lessons and making sure certain people know their place." My stomach began to tighten as Zoe continued. "At first I thought maybe it was about work drama or something, but then she said Chloe's name. She said something like, that girl needs to understand that not everyone gets to be special, and that she had a plan to handle the situation before prom." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Victoria hadn't destroyed the dress in a moment of impulse or even ordinary cruelty. She'd planned it in advance, discussing her intentions with someone else beforehand. This transformed the incident from destructive behavior into premeditated malice. "Zoe, are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" "Positive." "And Mrs. Hartwell, there's more." After she hung up, Brianna asked her mom what that was about, and Mrs. Barnes said she was just handling some family business. But she was smiling when she said it, like she was excited about whatever she was planning. I thanked Zoe for her courage in calling me, knowing that sharing this information put her in an awkward position with Brianna, and potentially with Victoria herself. After we hung up, I immediately called Natalie and relayed what I'd learned. "Diana, this changes everything," Natalie said, her paralegal training evident in how quickly she grasped the implications. If Victoria was planning this destruction in advance and discussing it with others, that's not just property damage anymore. That's criminal mischief with intent, possibly harassment, and depending on how the conversation went, it could even be conspiracy. The legal terminology felt surreal when applied to family drama, but I was beginning to understand that Victoria had crossed lines that transformed personal conflict into criminal behavior. What should I do with this information? Document it. Write down exactly what Zoe told you, when she called, what time frame she's talking about. And Diana, I think it's time to call your mother. The suggestion made my chest tight with anxiety. Judge Margaret Hartwell was a formidable woman who'd built her career on unwavering principles of justice and accountability. She loved both her daughters, but she'd never tolerated behavior that crossed legal boundaries, regardless of family relationships. Still, approaching her about Victoria felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Before I could lose my nerve, I called the courthouse and asked to speak with my mother's clerk. David Kim, who'd worked for Judge Hartwell for over 15 years, recognized my voice immediately. Diana, your mother's in session until 4, but I can ask her to call you when she has a break. Is everything all right? I hesitated, then decided on honesty. David, I need to speak with her about a legal matter involving family. It's complicated, but it may require her professional guidance rather than just maternal advice. There was a pause that told me David understood the distinction I was making. Judge Hartwell wore many hats, but she was scrupulously careful about separating her roles as a mother from her responsibilities as a federal judge. If I was requesting her professional perspective, it meant the situation had escalated beyond typical family disagreements. I'll make sure she gets the message, David said. Will you be available around 4:30? That afternoon, I picked up Chloe from school early and drove to the quiet park near our apartment where we could talk without interruption. I needed to prepare her for the possibility that our family conflict was about to become a legal matter, and I wanted her to understand why I was considering involving her grandmother in an official capacity. Chloe listened with the kind of focused attention that reminded me she was more mature than her 17 years should require. When I finished explaining about Zoe's phone call and the implications of Victoria's premeditation, she was quiet for a long time. Mom, are you saying that Grandma might have to arrest Aunt Victoria? The question was so direct and practical that it caught me off guard. I don't know, sweetheart. Your grandmother will help us understand what our options are and what the legal consequences might be for what Victoria did. But, Chloe, I need you to know that once we involve the court system, this stops being a family matter that we can resolve privately. She nodded solemnly, then surprised me with her next comment. Good. Because what she did wasn't a family matter anyway. It was mean and wrong, and if it was anyone else who destroyed my stuff, you'd want them to face consequences. The wisdom in her observation hit me like a revelation. I'd been struggling with guilt about potentially criminalizing Victoria's behavior because she was family, but Chloe was right. If a stranger or even an acquaintance had deliberately destroyed $400 worth of her property, I wouldn't hesitate to seek legal recourse. Family relationships don't create exemptions from basic standards of decency and respect for other people's property. If anything, family members should be held to higher standards because of the trust and vulnerability involved in those relationships. My phone rang at exactly 4:30. Judge Margaret Hartwell's voice carried the particular tone she used when switching from her judicial role to her maternal one, though I could hear traces of courthouse formality underneath her greeting. Diana, David said you needed to discuss a legal matter involving family. What's going on? I took a deep breath and laid out the entire situation, from the dress destruction to Victoria's social media manipulation to Zoe's revelation about premeditation. I tried to stick to facts rather than emotions, presenting the information the way I might to any legal professional, rather than to my mother. Judge Hartwell listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds that suggested she was taking notes. When I finished, there was a long silence that I didn't dare break. Diana, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, regardless of family considerations. Are you seeking legal advice, or are you asking me to intervene as Victoria's mother? The distinction was crucial, and I understood why she needed clarification. As Victoria's mother, she might try to mediate or encourage private resolution. As a federal judge, she would focus on whether crimes had been committed and what the appropriate legal response should be. I'm seeking legal advice, Mom. I need to understand whether Victoria's actions constitute criminal behavior and what my options are for protecting Chloe from further harassment. Another pause. Then her voice became cooler and more professional. Based on what you've described, Victoria has committed at least 2 potential crimes. Destruction of property over $300 is a felony in Connecticut. If she planned this destruction in advance and discussed it with others, that could constitute criminal mischief with intent, which carries enhanced penalties. Hearing my mother speak about Victoria's behavior in terms of felony charges made the situation feel suddenly real and irreversible. These weren't family squabbles anymore. These were crimes with specific statutes and potential jail time. What would happen if I filed a police report? The district attorney would review the evidence and decide whether to press charges. Given the value of the destroyed property and evidence of premeditation, prosecution would be likely. Victoria would be arrested, arraigned, and would face trial unless she accepted a plea agreement. The clinical recitation of legal procedures involving my sister felt surreal, but I could hear something else in my mother's voice. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a kind of grim inevitability, as if she'd been expecting something like this for years. Mom, can I ask what you think I should do? Judge Hartwell was quiet for almost a minute before responding. As your mother, I want to protect both my daughters from consequences that might be permanent. As a judge, I've seen too many cases where family members enable destructive behavior until it escalates to something truly tragic. Diana, Victoria has been testing boundaries her entire adult life, and each time family loyalty protected her from real consequences, she learned that she could push further. The observation stung because it was true. Victoria's pattern of manipulative behavior had been developing for decades, enabled by family members who prioritized peace over accountability. Every time someone chose to overlook her actions for the sake of family harmony, they'd inadvertently taught her that family relationships could insulate her from normal social and legal consequences. There's something else you should know, Judge Hartwell continued. Victoria called me yesterday, presumably after your confrontation at your apartment. She wanted to discuss your unstable behavior and suggested that maybe Chloe would be better off in a more stable family environment. The words hit me like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just destroyed Chloe's dress and tried to manipulate the social narrative. She'd also attempted to use my mother's position to question my fitness as a parent, potentially setting the stage for some kind of custody challenge. She's trying to turn you against me? She's trying to manipulate me the same way she's manipulated family dynamics for years, Judge Hartwell said firmly. But Diana, I've been watching these patterns longer than you might realize. Victoria's behavior has been escalating, and I've been concerned about where it might lead. That evening, Chloe and I sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down everything we could remember about Victoria's behavior over the past year. What emerged was a timeline of gradually increasing boundary violations and manipulative tactics that painted a disturbing picture of someone systematically undermining our family relationships. The dress destruction wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of psychological manipulation designed to establish Victoria's dominance and our subordination within the family hierarchy. She'd been testing our responses, learning our vulnerabilities, and building towards something that would demonstrate her power while appearing to maintain plausible deniability. But she'd made a crucial miscalculation. By destroying property with clear monetary value and discussing her plans with others beforehand, she'd crossed from psychological manipulation into criminal territory. And by trying to manipulate Judge Hartwell against me, she'd revealed the true scope of her ambitions. The next morning, I called the Millbrook Police Department and asked to speak with someone about filing a report for destruction of property. The desk sergeant connected me with Detective Lisa Park, a woman who specialized in domestic disputes and property crimes. Detective Park listened to my account with professional attention, occasionally asking for clarification about timelines and evidence. When I mentioned the photographs I'd taken and the witness account from Zoe, her interest sharpened noticeably. Mrs. Hartwell, I want to be clear about what filing this report means, Detective Park said. Once we begin an investigation, this becomes a matter of public record. If we find sufficient evidence to support charges, the district attorney will decide whether to prosecute regardless of your family's preferences. The finality in her voice made me understand that this was my last chance to keep Victoria's crime within the family sphere. Once I signed that police report, the legal system would take control of the situation, and family loyalty would become irrelevant to the proceedings. I thought about Chloe's wisdom in the park, about the pattern of escalation that my mother had identified, about Victoria's attempt to undermine my parenting through manipulation. I thought about the scared girl who'd called me with information about premeditation, risking her own social connections to ensure justice was served. Most importantly, I thought about what message I would send to my daughter if I chose family peace over accountability. If I taught her that people who share your DNA get to hurt you without consequences. I'd like to file the report, I said firmly. My daughter deserves better than a family that enables cruelty for the sake of maintaining appearances. Detective Park nodded approvingly. We'll need you to come in tomorrow morning to make your formal statement. Bring all the evidence you have, photographs, documentation of financial impact, any written communications with your sister. We'll also want to interview your daughter and the friend who overheard the planning conversation. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange combination of relief and terror. For the first time in weeks, I'd taken action that might actually protect Chloe from further manipulation and abuse. But I'd also set in motion a process that would fundamentally change our family relationships forever. That afternoon, I received a text message from Victoria that seemed almost psychically timed to my conversation with the police. Diana, I think we need to talk about moving forward constructively. Family is too important to let misunderstandings damage our relationships permanently. The message's timing felt like more than coincidence. Either Victoria had some awareness that I was considering legal action, or she'd received guidance from someone who understood the potential consequences of her behavior. The sudden pivot to reconciliation language suggested that she might finally be grasping the seriousness of what she'd done. But it was too late for private resolution. The pattern of escalation had already reached a point where only external intervention could provide adequate protection. Victoria's crime against Chloe had been documented, reported, and would soon be investigated by professionals who weren't invested in maintaining family harmony at the expense of justice. I didn't respond to her text. Instead, I spent the evening helping Chloe prepare for her final dress fitting, focusing on the positive aspects of her prom experience that we'd managed to salvage despite Victoria's sabotage. The emerald dress fit perfectly after Mrs. Costas's expert alterations, and the silver embroidery caught the light beautifully as Chloe moved. She looked sophisticated and confident, ready for a night that would mark her transition from high school to whatever adventures awaited her in college. But more than that, she looked like a young woman who understood that she deserved respect and protection, even from family members who claimed to love her. The legal process we were about to enter would be difficult and potentially painful, but it would also teach her that actions have consequences, and that no one gets to abuse the people we love without facing accountability. Tomorrow would bring formal statements and police interviews, and the beginning of a legal process that might end with Victoria facing criminal charges. Tonight, though, we celebrated the fact that kindness had triumphed over cruelty, that strangers had shown more loyalty than family, and that my daughter would go to prom in a dress that made her feel as beautiful as she truly was. The police station smelled like industrial coffee and disinfectant, a combination that somehow managed to be both sterile and overwhelming at the same time. Detective Park led us through a maze of cubicles to a small interview room with gray walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Chloe sat beside me, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing the kind of serious expression that teenagers adopt when they realize adults are treating them like adults. Detective Park's questions were thorough and methodical, designed to establish a clear timeline of events and motivations. She asked Chloe to describe the scene at Victoria's house in her own words, paying particular attention to Victoria's demeanor before, during, and after the destruction. When Chloe mentioned the deliberate precision of the cuts and Victoria's calm satisfaction afterward, Detective Park made detailed notes and asked for clarification about specific details. Chloe, I want you to think carefully about this next question, Detective Park said, leaning forward slightly. In your opinion, based on what you observed, do you believe your aunt intended to destroy your dress when she picked up those scissors? Chloe considered the question with the kind of thoughtfulness that made me proud of how we'd raised her to value honesty over convenience. Yes, ma'am. She wasn't trying to help with alterations or anything like that. She picked up the scissors and started cutting before anyone could stop her. And afterward, she wasn't sorry or surprised. She was satisfied, like she'd accomplished exactly what she meant to do. The clarity of Chloe's testimony seemed to make an impression on Detective Park, who nodded approvingly before moving on to questions about the financial impact and our attempts to find a replacement dress. When we mentioned Mrs. Costas's kindness in helping us find an alternative, Detective Park smiled for the first time since we'd arrived. After Chloe's interview, Detective Park asked me to review my written statement and sign the formal complaint. The document transformed our family crisis into legal language, reducing Victoria's cruelty to specific charges and statutory violations that carried prescribed penalties. Seeing it in black and white made the situation feel both more serious and more manageable somehow, as if naming the problem officially was the first step toward solving it. Mrs. Hartwell, I want to prepare you for what happens next, Detective Park said as we concluded the interview. We'll contact your sister within the next 48 hours to arrange for her to come in for questioning. She'll have the right to bring an attorney, and I strongly suspect she will. This will likely become public knowledge in your community fairly quickly. The warning about publicity made my stomach clench. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and a criminal investigation involving two prominent family names would generate significant gossip and speculation. Chloe would face questions from classmates, I'd deal with colleagues who suddenly found our family drama fascinating, and the whole situation would take on a life of its own beyond our control. That evening, I called Natalie to update her on the police interview and prepare for the social fallout that Detective Park had predicted. Natalie listened with the focused attention of someone who understood both the legal and personal implications of what we'd set in motion. Diana, you did the right thing, but you need to be prepared for Victoria to fight back hard, Natalie said. People like her don't accept accountability gracefully. She's going to try to discredit you, probably claim you're being vindictive or unstable, maybe even suggest that you're using Chloe as a weapon in some imaginary family feud. The prediction proved prophetic sooner than I'd expected. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages from extended family members, family friends, and even some of Chloe's classmates' parents. Victoria had apparently spent the previous evening making phone calls, sharing her version of events before the official investigation could establish the facts. The story she was telling bore only passing resemblance to reality. According to Victoria's narrative, I was a bitter single mother who'd always been jealous of her success and stability. The dress incident had been blown out of proportion because I was looking for any excuse to attack her, and involving the police was a vindictive overreaction designed to hurt her reputation and relationships. Most disturbing was the claim that Chloe was being coached to lie about what she'd witnessed, that I was using my own daughter as a weapon against Victoria because I couldn't handle my sister's happiness and prosperity. The accusation was so outrageous and hurtful that it took my breath away, but I could see how it might sound plausible to people who didn't know the real situation. Several of the messages I received that morning reflected Victoria's influence. Cousin Patricia wanted to know if I'd considered family counseling instead of involving law enforcement. Uncle Robert suggested that maybe this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved privately if everyone just calmed down and acted like adults. Even Mrs. Henderson from down the street called to say she hoped we could work things out because family was so important. The subtext was clear. I was being blamed for escalating a private matter into public drama, regardless of the actual crimes that had been committed. Victoria had successfully positioned herself as the victim of my unreasonable behavior, creating a narrative that made my pursuit of justice seem petty and vindictive. But then I received a call that changed everything. David Kim's voice was carefully neutral when he reached me that Tuesday afternoon. Diana, Judge Hartwell would like to see you in her chambers this afternoon at 4 o'clock. She asked me to tell you to bring any documentation you have related to your recent police report. The formal tone told me that this wasn't a maternal summons but a judicial one. My mother wanted to review the evidence in her official capacity, which meant she was taking the situation seriously enough to consider it from a legal rather than familial perspective. I arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early, carrying a folder with photographs, police reports, and the timeline Chloe and I had constructed. The federal building was imposing in the way government architecture was designed to be, with marble floors and high ceilings that made visitors feel appropriately small and respectful of the proceedings that took place within its walls. David Kim escorted me through security and up to the judicial offices, past portraits of previous judges and framed constitutional amendments that reminded everyone of the serious business conducted here. Judge Hartwell's chambers were both elegant and intimidating, with law books lining the walls and windows that looked out over downtown Hartford. My mother sat behind her desk in full judicial robes, her expression unreadable in the way that had made her reputation as a fair but formidable judge. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, and I noticed that she had several documents spread out in front of her, including what appeared to be police reports and legal briefs. "Diana, I've reviewed the complaint you filed against Victoria," she began without preamble. "I've also received several phone calls from family members expressing concern about the situation, including one from Victoria herself, requesting that I intervene to stop what she characterizes as harassment." My heart sank as I realized that Victoria had tried to use her relationship with Judge Hartwell to influence the legal proceedings. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity, but I also understood that it put my mother in an impossible position between her judicial responsibilities and her family relationships. "Before you say anything," Judge Hartwell continued, "I want you to understand that I've recused myself from any direct involvement in this case. I cannot and will not use my position to influence the investigation or prosecution of charges against Victoria. However, I can review the evidence as a concerned family member and offer my perspective on the legal merits of your complaint." The distinction was important, and I appreciated that she'd made it clear from the beginning. She was speaking to me as my mother, but with the legal expertise that came from decades of judicial experience. I presented my documentation methodically, walking through the timeline of events, the photographs of the destroyed dress, Zoe's testimony about premeditation, and the pattern of escalating manipulation that had led to the current crisis. Judge Hartwell listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details or requesting additional evidence. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of intense focus that had intimidated attorneys for over 20 years. "Diana, what outcome are you seeking from this legal action? Are you looking for financial restitution, criminal penalties for Victoria, or something else?" The question forced me to articulate goals that I hadn't fully examined myself. "I want Victoria to face consequences that might actually change her behavior. I want Chloe to understand that no one has the right to destroy her property or manipulate her emotions, even family members. And honestly, Mom, I want protection from further harassment and manipulation." Judge Hartwell nodded slowly, then reached for one of the documents on her desk. "Diana, I need to tell you something that might influence your decision about how to proceed. Yesterday, I received a request from Victoria's attorney to file a restraining order against you, claiming that you've been harassing her and making false accusations that are damaging her reputation." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just defending herself against my complaint. She was launching a counterattack designed to paint me as the aggressor in this situation. The restraining order request was clearly meant to flip the narrative, making her appear to be the victim of my vindictive behavior rather than the perpetrator of criminal destruction. "The request is legally frivolous," Judge Hartwell continued, "but it demonstrates that Victoria is prepared to escalate this conflict significantly. She's hired Jonathan Mercer, one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the state, which suggests she's taking this very seriously." The mention of expensive legal representation made my stomach turn. Jonathan Mercer was the kind of attorney who specialized in defending wealthy clients against criminal charges, using every possible tactic to avoid accountability. His involvement suggested that Victoria understood the potential severity of the charges she was facing, and was prepared to spend significant money to avoid consequences. "Mom, what should I do?" Judge Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of both judicial wisdom and maternal concern. "Diana, I've been a federal judge for over 2 decades, and I've seen thousands of cases involving family conflicts that escalated into criminal territory. In my experience, the families that heal are the ones that insist on accountability, even when it's painful. The families that don't heal are the ones that prioritize peace over justice. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city with her hands clasped behind her back. Victoria has been enabled by family loyalty her entire adult life. Every time someone chose to overlook her behavior for the sake of maintaining harmony, they taught her that family relationships could insulate her from normal consequences. This pattern has been escalating for years, and it was always going to reach a breaking point eventually. The observation stung because it was true, but it also felt liberating to hear it acknowledged by someone with the authority and wisdom to make such judgments. Judge Hartwell turned back to face me, and I could see something in her expression that looked like resolve. Diana, tomorrow morning I'm scheduled to preside over a preliminary hearing for an unrelated case. However, there will be media present because it involves a public corruption matter that's received significant attention. If Victoria's attorney files any motions or requests related to your case, they will become part of the public record immediately. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. If Victoria continued to escalate this conflict through legal manipulation, she would do so in full view of the media and public scrutiny that attended high-profile court proceedings. Judge Hartwell was warning me that the stakes were about to become much higher than a simple family dispute. That evening, I sat with Chloe at our kitchen table, explaining what I'd learned about Victoria's counterattack and the involvement of expensive legal representation. Chloe listened with the kind of serious attention that reminded me she was months away from legal adulthood herself. "Mom, are you scared?" she asked when I finished. The question deserved an honest answer. "Yes, sweetheart, I am scared. But I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't stand up to this behavior. If we let Victoria manipulate and hurt people without consequences, she'll just keep doing it to other people." Chloe nodded thoughtfully, then surprised me with her next comment. "I'm proud of you for not backing down. Even if this gets really hard, I want people to know that what she did was wrong." The next morning brought news that changed everything once again. Detective Park called me at 7:30, her voice carrying an urgency that made my chest tighten with anxiety. "Mrs. Hartwell, we attempted to contact your sister yesterday for voluntary questioning, and her attorney informed us that she's prepared to surrender herself for booking this morning. However, there's been a complication that you need to know about." I gripped the phone tighter, bracing myself for whatever new development Victoria had orchestrated. "What kind of complication?" "Jonathan Mercer has requested that the booking and arraignment take place in federal court rather than state court, claiming that your mother's position as a federal judge creates a conflict of interest that requires federal oversight. The request is unusual, but it means that today's proceedings will take place in your mother's courthouse." The implications were staggering. Victoria's legal strategy had somehow maneuvered the situation so that her criminal case would unfold in front of Judge Hartwell, creating maximum drama and potential embarrassment for our family. Whether this was brilliant legal maneuvering or catastrophic miscalculation remained to be seen. "Detective Park, will my mother be presiding over Victoria's arraignment?" There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to understand that the answer was complicated. "That decision will be made by the chief judge this morning. However, Mrs. Hartwell, you should know that your sister's case has attracted media attention because of your family's prominence in the legal community. There will likely be cameras present for today's proceedings." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Victoria's attempt to manipulate the legal system had backfired spectacularly. Instead of avoiding accountability, she'd ensured that her criminal behavior would be exposed in the most public possible forum, with media coverage that would make her actions a matter of permanent public record. The game had changed once again, but this time, the rules favored justice over manipulation. Whatever happened in that courthouse today would determine not just the legal consequences for Victoria's crimes, but the future dynamics of our entire family. The federal courthouse buzzed with unusual energy that Thursday morning, the kind of heightened atmosphere that occurs when routine proceedings intersect with local drama that has captured public attention. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Local reporters stood in clusters near the entrance, checking their equipment and rehearsing sound bites about family conflict escalating into federal criminal proceedings. I arrived 30 minutes before Victoria's scheduled arraignment, accompanied by Chloe and Natalie, who had taken the morning off work to provide moral support. The media presence was more extensive than I'd anticipated, with cameras from 3 local television stations and reporters from newspapers I recognized from their coverage of other high-profile legal proceedings in Hartford County. David Kim met us at the security checkpoint, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain from managing the unexpected attention surrounding what should have been a routine criminal case. He guided us through the metal detectors and up to the 3rd floor, where Judge Hartwell's courtroom was already filling with spectators who had come to witness what local media was calling the prom dress prosecution. "Your mother wanted me to tell you that she's recused herself from this case," David explained as we walked through the marble corridors. Judge Patricia Romano will be presiding over today's arraignment. However, Judge Hartwell will be present in the courtroom as a family member, not in any official capacity. The distinction was important for legal reasons, but I understood that my mother's presence would add another layer of complexity to proceedings that were already emotionally charged. Victoria would have to face criminal charges in front of the woman who had raised her, taught her right from wrong, and now served as a federal judge who had built her career on upholding the law without regard for personal relationships. Judge Romano's courtroom was smaller than my mother's chambers but carried the same sense of formal authority that made everyone speak in respectful whispers. The prosecution table was occupied by Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s who specialized in property crimes and domestic disputes. Her reputation for thorough preparation and reluctance to accept plea bargains that didn't include meaningful accountability had earned her respect from both defense attorneys and victims' advocates. At exactly 9 o'clock, a side door opened, and Victoria entered the courtroom, flanked by Jonathan Mercer and a junior associate, whose primary function appeared to be carrying legal briefs and looking serious. Victoria had dressed for the occasion in a navy blue suit that suggested both respectability and humility, though the designer label was still visible to anyone who understood fashion well enough to recognize expensive clothing when they saw it. What struck me most powerfully was how different Victoria looked from the confident woman who had destroyed Chloe's dress with such casual cruelty. Her usual composure was intact, but there was something brittle around the edges, a tension that suggested she was finally beginning to understand that her actions had consequences she couldn't manipulate or control through charm and social connections. Judge Romano called the court to order with the kind of authoritative presence that immediately commanded attention from everyone present. She reviewed the charges methodically, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom sound system and ensuring that both the defendant and the media representatives could hear every word of the proceedings. The defendant, Victoria Hartwell Barnes, is charged with criminal mischief in the 1st degree, a Class D felony, and harassment in the 2nd degree, a Class A misdemeanor, Judge Romano announced. These charges stem from the alleged deliberate destruction of property belonging to a minor family member and subsequent attempts to intimidate the victim and her mother. The formal language transformed Victoria's cruelty into legal terms that carried specific penalties and requirements for proof. But hearing the charges read aloud in federal court made the seriousness of her actions undeniable. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was criminal behavior that the state of Connecticut had decided to prosecute regardless of family relationships or social standing. Jonathan Mercer rose to enter Victoria's plea, his expensive suit and practiced demeanor conveying the kind of legal confidence that came from decades of defending wealthy clients against criminal charges. However, instead of entering a simple not guilty plea, he requested permission to address the court about what he characterized as irregularities in the investigation and prosecution of this case. Judge Romano's expression remained neutral, but I could see a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was not impressed with Mercer's apparent attempt to turn a routine arraignment into a forum for attacking the prosecution's case. "Mr. Mercer, this is an arraignment, not a preliminary hearing. Your client may enter a plea of guilty, not guilty, or no contest. Other matters can be addressed through appropriate motions filed with the court." Mercer persisted, despite the judge's clear guidance. launching into what appeared to be a prepared speech about prosecutorial overreach and the inappropriate involvement of federal resources in what he characterized as a minor family dispute. His strategy seemed designed to minimize the seriousness of Victoria's actions, while suggesting that the charges were motivated by personal vendettas rather than legitimate criminal behavior. Your Honor, my client is the victim of a vindictive prosecution orchestrated by family members who seek to use the legal system as a weapon in ongoing personal conflicts, Mercer declared, with the kind of dramatic flair that might have been effective in front of a jury but seemed inappropriate for an arraignment hearing. Judge Romano's patience visibly thinned as Mercer continued his performance. Mr. Mercer, I will not tolerate attempts to turn this proceeding into a trial of the prosecution's motivations. Your client will enter a plea, or I will enter a plea of not guilty on her behalf, and schedule this matter for trial. It was at that moment that Victoria made the decision that would define the rest of the proceedings and, ultimately, her future. Instead of allowing her attorney to enter a not guilty plea and fight the charges through normal legal channels, she stood up and requested permission to address the court directly. The request was unusual enough that Judge Romano paused to consider it carefully. Defendants rarely spoke during arraignment proceedings beyond confirming their understanding of the charges, and experienced defense attorneys typically advised their clients to remain silent until they understood the full scope of the prosecution's evidence. Ms. Barnes, you have the right to address the court, but I must advise you that anything you say will become part of the official record and may be used as evidence in future proceedings. Do you understand this warning? Victoria nodded confidently, apparently believing that her ability to charm and manipulate people would work as effectively in federal court as it had in social situations throughout her adult life. What she failed to understand was that Judge Romano had spent years listening to defendants attempt to justify criminal behavior through personal narratives that cast them as victims of circumstances beyond their control. Your Honor, I want the court to understand that this entire situation has been blown completely out of proportion by family members who have always resented my success and stability. Victoria began, her voice carrying the same tone of injured innocence she had used when destroying Chloe's dress. The dress incident was a misunderstanding that occurred during what should have been a private family conversation about appropriate expectations for teenagers. The characterization of premeditated destruction as a misunderstanding was so audacious that I heard several people in the courtroom gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that her words were being recorded by court reporters and broadcast live on local television. My niece has been allowed to develop unrealistic expectations about what her family owes her, and sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about teaching important life lessons. Victoria continued, her confidence growing as she spoke. The dress in question was inappropriate for a girl her age, and far too expensive for my sister's financial situation. I was simply trying to help Chloe understand that not everyone gets to be treated like a princess just because they want something. The courtroom fell completely silent, as Victoria's words revealed the depth of her contempt for both Chloe and me, along with her complete lack of understanding about appropriate boundaries and legal accountability. She had just confessed to deliberately destroying the dress while attempting to justify her actions through a narrative that painted a 17-year-old girl as spoiled and entitled for wanting to attend prom in a dress that made her feel beautiful. Judge Romano's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see something cold and final settling behind her eyes as Victoria continued to speak. Furthermore, Your Honor, I believe this prosecution is being influenced by my mother's position as a federal judge and my sister's desire to use family connections to punish me for decisions she doesn't agree with. The accusation that Judge Hartwell was somehow manipulating the legal system to persecute Victoria was so outrageous that it seemed to suck all the air out of the courtroom. I glanced toward where my mother sat in the gallery, her face a mask of judicial composure that revealed nothing about her thoughts or emotions. Jonathan Mercer was frantically trying to get Victoria's attention, apparently realizing that his client was destroying her own defense through spontaneous admissions of guilt and attacks on the integrity of the federal judicial system. But Victoria was too committed to her narrative of victimhood to notice her attorney's distress. I've spent my entire adult life trying to maintain family harmony and help my sister raise her daughter properly. Victoria continued, her voice rising slightly as she warmed to her theme. Chloe needed to learn that actions have consequences and that not everyone gets everything they want just because they cry loud enough. The dress was just fabric, but the lesson about humility and realistic expectations was priceless. It was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. Judge Romano, who had been listening to Victoria's speech with professional detachment, suddenly leaned forward and spoke in a voice that carried absolute authority. Ms. Barnes, are you stating for the record that you deliberately destroyed your niece's prom dress in order to teach her what you considered to be an appropriate lesson about humility and realistic expectations? The question was phrased with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to create an official record that would be difficult to challenge or reinterpret later. Victoria, apparently not understanding the legal significance of what she was being asked, nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly what I'm saying. Someone needed to teach that girl that the world doesn't revolve around her desires, and since my sister clearly wasn't going to provide appropriate guidance, I took responsibility for ensuring Chloe learned some important life lessons. Judge Romano made a note on the documents in front of her, then looked up with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something much more serious. Ms. Barnes, you have just confessed to deliberately destroying property belonging to a minor, with the intent to cause emotional distress for what you characterized as educational purposes. Do you understand that this confession constitutes an admission of guilt to the charges filed against you? The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as the significance of Victoria's statements began to sink in for the media representatives and spectators who had come to witness what they expected to be a routine legal proceeding. Victoria's face went pale as she apparently began to realize that her attempt to justify her actions had instead provided the prosecution with a complete confession delivered under oath in federal court. Jonathan Mercer stood up quickly, his professional composure finally cracking under the strain of watching his client destroy her own case through voluntary admissions of guilt. Your Honor, I request a brief recess to consult with my client about the implications of her statements. Judge Romano's response was swift and decisive. Mr. Mercer, your client has made voluntary statements under oath in open court. Those statements are now part of the official record and cannot be withdrawn or modified through attorney consultation. She turned her attention back to Victoria, who was finally beginning to understand that her social manipulation tactics had not only failed in federal court, but had actually made her legal situation much worse. Ms. Barnes, based on your sworn statements in this courtroom, I am finding you guilty of criminal mischief in the first degree and harassment in the second degree. The speed of the conviction was breathtaking, made possible by Victoria's own words and her apparent belief that she could charm her way out of accountability even after confessing to deliberate criminal behavior. Judge Romano continued without pausing for objections or requests for reconsideration. Furthermore, Ms. Barnes, your statements reveal a pattern of manipulative and controlling behavior directed toward family members, including attempts to undermine parental authority and emotionally abuse a minor child. The court finds these actions particularly disturbing given your apparent belief that such behavior is justified by your personal opinions about appropriate child-rearing practices. Judge Romano reached for her gavel, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she prepared to announce Victoria's sentence. But before she could speak, something unprecedented happened that would make this case a landmark in Connecticut legal history. The courtroom's main doors opened, and Judge Margaret Hartwell walked forward with the measured pace of someone who had made a decision that would define her legacy as both a federal judge and a mother. She was carrying a single sheet of paper that she handed to David Kim, who immediately approached the bench to deliver it to Judge Romano. Judge Romano read the document quickly, her eyebrows rising slightly as she processed whatever information it contained. She looked from the paper to Judge Hartwell, then back to Victoria, who was watching this unexpected development with growing alarm. Ms. Barnes, Judge Romano said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward to hear her words clearly. I have just received a federal arrest warrant, signed by Judge Margaret Hartwell, in her official capacity as a federal judge. This warrant charges you with additional federal crimes including wire fraud, attempted intimidation of witnesses, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The words hit the courtroom like a physical force, creating a moment of absolute silence before erupting into chaos as reporters began frantically typing on their phones, and court personnel moved to secure the area for what had suddenly become a much more serious legal proceeding. Victoria stared at her mother in shock, apparently unable to process that Judge Hartwell had just issued a federal arrest warrant against her own daughter. The reality that her manipulation and intimidation tactics had not only failed but had actually escalated her legal troubles to the federal level seemed to overwhelm her capacity for response. Judge Romano continued reading from the warrant, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system and ensuring that every word was recorded by the multiple news cameras that were broadcasting the proceedings live to audiences throughout Connecticut. The federal charges stem from Ms. Barnes's attempts to use electronic communications to intimidate witnesses in this case, her efforts to manipulate federal judicial proceedings through false representations, and her conspiracy with others to obstruct the investigation of her initial crimes, Judge Romano announced. She looked directly at Victoria, who was now visibly trembling as the full scope of her legal predicament became clear. Ms. Barnes, these federal charges carry potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison and fines of up to $250,000. Combined with your conviction on the state charges, you are facing significant incarceration time and financial penalties. Jonathan Mercer attempted one final intervention, standing to request that his client be allowed to withdraw her previous statements and enter a proper plea to all charges. However, Judge Romano's response was swift and final. Mr. Mercer, your client's statements were made voluntarily under oath in open court and have been broadcast live on television. There is no legal mechanism for withdrawing confessions that have been delivered publicly and recorded as part of official court proceedings. It was at that moment that the true genius of Judge Hartwell's strategy became apparent. By allowing Victoria to confess publicly to the state charges before revealing the federal warrant, she had ensured that Victoria's own words would provide irrefutable evidence of criminal intent and premeditation that could be used to prosecute the more serious federal charges. Victoria had been so confident in her ability to manipulate the legal system that she had voluntarily provided prosecutors with everything they needed to convict her on charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. Her attempt to use family connections and social manipulation to avoid accountability had backfired so spectacularly that she had actually escalated a misdemeanor case into federal felony charges that carried life-changing consequences. Judge Romano announced Victoria's immediate remand to federal custody pending arraignment on the new charges, which would take place the following Monday in front of a different federal judge to avoid any appearance of family influence on the proceedings. As federal marshals approached to take Victoria into custody, she finally seemed to understand that her years of manipulation and cruelty had caught up with her in the most public and humiliating way possible. The media coverage of Victoria's arrest and confession was immediate and extensive, with video clips of her courtroom statements being broadcast on local and national news programs within hours of the proceedings. The story of a privileged woman who destroyed her teenage niece's prom dress and then confessed to the crime on live television while trying to justify her actions became a viral sensation that sparked conversations about family dynamics, accountability, and the limits of privilege. For Chloe and me, the resolution brought a mixture of relief and sadness that was difficult to process completely. Justice had been served in a way that exceeded our most optimistic expectations, but the cost had been the complete destruction of family relationships that had once meant something to us. That evening, we sat together on our couch watching news coverage of Victoria's arrest and confession, trying to make sense of how quickly our lives had changed from private family crisis to national news story. Chloe looked beautiful in her emerald prom dress, which she had insisted on wearing despite everything that had happened. "Mom, do you think Aunt Victoria will ever understand why what she did was wrong?" Chloe asked, her voice carrying the kind of thoughtful sadness that comes from watching someone you love face consequences for choices they made freely. The question deserved an honest answer, even if it wasn't the one either of us wanted to hear. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people are so committed to believing they're always right that they can't see how their actions affect other people. But what matters is that you understand that what she did was wrong, and that no one has the right to hurt you just because they can. Later that week, Mrs. Costas called to tell us that she had donated the original pattern for Chloe's emerald dress to a non-profit organization that provided prom dresses to girls who couldn't afford them. The gesture seemed like the perfect ending to a story that had begun with cruelty and manipulation, but had ultimately revealed the power of kindness and accountability to triumph over privilege and abuse. 6 months later, Victoria was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory community service, working with organizations that help victims of family abuse. The federal charges had been reduced through a plea agreement that required her to take full responsibility for her actions and complete psychological counseling designed to address her manipulative and controlling behaviors. Judge Hartwell retired from the federal bench shortly after Victoria's sentencing, explaining in her resignation letter that she wanted to focus on family relationships and ensuring that the next generation understood the importance of accountability and respect for others. Her decision to issue the arrest warrant against her own daughter had been praised by legal experts as an example of judicial integrity that put the law above personal relationships. For Chloe and me, the experience taught us that sometimes protecting the people you love requires taking stands that are difficult and painful, even when they involve family members who claim to care about you. The emerald dress still hangs in Chloe's closet, a reminder that kindness from strangers can matter more than cruelty from family, and that justice, when it finally arrives, can be more satisfying than any revenge. The viral video of Victoria's courtroom confession continues to be shared on social media as an example of how privilege and manipulation can backfire when they encounter systems designed to hold everyone accountable, regardless of their social connections or family relationships. For us, though, it represents something much more personal. The moment when truth finally triumphed over manipulation, and when a teenage girl learned that she deserved better than a family that would destroy her dreams and call it love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.